What's going on, Perform24 family? Levi Jaeckel here, back with another video. Before we get into today's topic, I do want to say thank you. I'm making these YouTube videos partially as a creative outlet for myself, but also kind of as like a log for myself, almost like a record keeping, a video record. I do have a training business, obviously, and I use these videos as business resources. So if people ask me questions, sometimes it's just easiest for me to shoot them a video. And if I have a bank of videos that I can share, obviously it makes my outreach a little easier. But the last video that I posted got like 10 or 12 times more views than normal. So if you guys are watching that, I really appreciate that. That always feels good when something clicks a little bit more than usual. So I wanted to say thank you right out of the gate. Now, let's get into today's topic. Man, I swear you guys always see me at my worst. I just finished working out. I'm kind of a mess right now. You guys never see me all nice and pretty and put together. So today's video is a topic that I think is a little unique to me and my business and Perform24. We're going to be talking about how I train athletes, how I train adults, and then how kind of my own personal training fits into all that. I think it's probably appropriate to rewind a little bit and give you a little bit of my history, a little Levi Jaeckel origin story. So I was an athlete in college. I went to the University of New Mexico, and so I was exposed in college to the traditional college strength and conditioning world. At the time, that was like my first experience understanding like true like human performance and true structured strength training. I grew up in Iowa, like a little small farm town, and you know, our strength and conditioning program was like, it wasn't very advanced. So when I went into college and saw like what a true like D1 program looked like, that was pretty mind-blowing to me. Now, as soon as I finished college, I went into the private sector. I got an internship at a really prestigious private training facility. So I moved to Dallas to be a part of that. And moving into the private sector as an intern, that was my first exposure to like truly world-class performance training. Now, my experience as an intern was really, really formative. And so all of my training now can be traced back to that initial internship. And so that kind of leads me to the way that we train pro athletes in here now. So we've talked about this in a couple videos in the past, but the training model that we have here today is identical as far as system. It doesn't matter who we're training, if we're training a youth athlete, if we're training a pro athlete, if we're training a local adult, everybody follows the same structure. Now, that structure can be manipulated in a million different ways, but the backbone training methodology is exactly the same for everybody. We have a single template that we program out of, and that template is just the organization and the structure of the individual sessions. How we start a session, how we flow, and how we progress a session, and then how we end a session is always the same. We have talked about how we sequence sessions, and we have talked about how we manipulate the sessions to get different results out of our clients, but we haven't talked about the phases, okay? And like that is really the big difference between how we train a pro and how we train a local adult. So when we're working with a pro athlete, there's a very linear progression. We know where they're gonna start. You know, when their competition season ends and they enter their off season, we know when that is gonna be, and then we also know when they're gonna be returning to their team. And so there's hard bookends on where they're starting and where they're finishing. The off-season program from there is a very step 1, step 2, step 3, 4, and 5 process. The reason that I use 5 steps there just as an example is that we have 5 phases that we primarily train in. And if you understand how we train a pro athlete, then it'll make a little bit more sense when I explain how we kind of tweak that for our adults. So we'll just keep with this numbered system. So running through the way that we program phases is we start with a general prep phase. And that general prep phase is like fundamental to our whole training system. We start with a general prep phase. Usually these are like total body lifts. There's a few more corrective exercises and mobility exercises in that phase specifically than other phases. But we're kind of like cleaning everything up, right? We're like kind of like making sure that the big rocks are in place in our foundation. So as soon as, we feel confident that, all the major movements are cleaned up and there's no crazy hiccups in an athlete's movement, we'll progress them into a hypertrophy phase. There's where we want to put a lot of mass on them. And then we move into a max phase. Rarely do we ever go into a true max phase. If you're talking to a power lifter, a max phase is like a full 100% 1 RM. You've got a deload, you've got a peak week, all those things. But for a pro athlete, that's not always the best idea. They don't really need to have a high 1 RM. That's not really what's important to them. So it's kind of like a modified blended max phase. From there, we start getting into a little bit more explosive and a little bit more sport-specific phases. We move into an explosive strength phase and then a speed strength phase. The speed strength phase is like the phase that they'll do right before they head to training camp or spring training or whatever their next move is. The speed strength stuff is like all the fancy stuff that you see on Instagram a lot, all the fancy drills and fancy plyometrics. Believe it or not, we rarely spend any time on those types of movements. We will do a few of them out on the turf just to make sure that they are ready to rock and roll, but most of their training is a little bit more boring and not quite as flashy as that. So those are the 5 phases, okay? So and they progress linearly. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 progression. When they finish phase 5, then they're heading into their sport. When we're working with adults, there's a couple elements from the athletes' programs that just don't apply to them. Again, kind of in the same thought process, but our adults rarely need a true max strength phase. We will get stronger and we will push strength, but we rarely go into a true maximum strength phase. So what we do instead is we start with the general prep, we'll go into a hypertrophy, we'll go back down to a general prep. Usually it's a little bit more advanced, maybe a little bit more volume, maybe a little bit more intensity, but it's still a general prep phase. Then we'll skip the max phase and we'll go to an explosive strength phase. The explosive strength phase is introducing, maybe some plyometrics if they haven't done that. If they have done that, we'll do like a little bit more advanced plyometrics. We'll get a little bit more reactive. We'll throw in some change of direction stuff, but they're getting a little bit more dynamic. After they finish that explosive strength phase, we're gonna go back to a general prep phase. So the way that I explain this is that we wanna build like really, really solid individuals, really fundamentally sound individuals. We'll kind of play outside that sandbox for a little bit, and then we'll come back to the sandbox. And then we'll get a little further outside of the sandbox, then we'll come back to the sandbox. So the sandbox in this analogy is the general prep phase. We really rely on killer general prep phases for our adult clients. So if you want to use that number system again, we go, phase 1, phase 2, back to phase 1, phase 4, back to phase 1. Hopefully that makes sense. So just like any system, this system is flexible, it's alive, right? We have a system that we follow because one, it does make for efficient programming and efficient coaching. We know what's coming up for our individuals, and we also know where they've been. So when we're coaching a session, we can coach the session in context of all of their training. If we're not following a repetitive pattern, we don't really know what's working, right? If we just throw a whole bunch of stuff on the board and just to see what sticks, maybe we'll get lucky or maybe it'll blow up in our face. If we follow the same repetition, ideally our programming and our service and our coaching and our product is going to improve over time because we have a baseline to compare it to. And then finally, just really quick, we'll touch on how I handle my own training. So personally, my brain works in a very linear fashion. I think that's one of the reasons why that internship was so impactful to me, is because they taught me a linear training process. As soon as I was exposed to this, it just stuck in my brain immediately. So I personally am a very like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5 kind of guy. Historically, most of my training has followed that linear pattern. However, over the last couple of years, I've kind of been expanding that. And we talked about this at the beginning of the Squattober video that I've filmed, is that The only way that I'm going to learn as a coach is if I'm tasting new things. So over the last couple of years, like I've worked with a couple military personnel. I knew that I wasn't an expert in like the tactical training, and so I started to explore that avenue. Sometimes I'll catch on to interesting like kettlebell complexes or something that might not apply to my athletes, but might apply to my adults. And so I'll spend a couple weeks, messing around with those. Obviously, like a lot of you guys during the lockdowns, I wasn't coming in here to do my own training. And so I was exploring with all the like garage gym and home gym equipment setups that a lot of you guys had to work around as well. And so, those types of elements kind of expand my training menu, if you want to use that term. So my own training kind of bounces around a little bit. It's not as structured as it used to be, but it's certainly not just chaotic. Also in 2020, and again, I've made a bunch of videos about this, is I have been setting like kind of audacious goals for myself that I work on for like a short amount of time. So earlier in the spring, I wanted to run a sub 6-minute mile on my 30th birthday, and so I trained a couple months to do that. Squat-tober was a big push for my barbell back squat. And I've got another one coming up. I'm not going to reveal that right now, but that gives you an idea on how I handle my own training. Okay, that's going to wrap up today's video. Like I said, I appreciate all of you guys that have watched up to this point. Please let me know if topics like this are interesting to you. Please let me know if you have any questions. I could talk about this stuff for hours, so hopefully it wasn't too nerdy for you. Hopefully you guys crush it today, and I'll see you in the next video.